In 1850, lumber wasn't just an industry in America, it was the industry. Bigger than anything else in the country. Entire towns rose and fell around a single sawmill. Fortunes were built swinging an axe. And yet today, fewer than 45,000 people in the entire United States still call themselves loggers. And only a few thousand of them still fell trees by hand with a chainsaw. So what happened to the most American job there is? The answer isn't one villain. It's two waves of machines and one law decades apart that quietly erased a way of life. Here's where this story goes. We'll look at just how massive this industry once was, and the men who built empires out of it. Then we'll trace two separate waves of mechanization, decades apart, that each cut deep into the workforce without most people noticing. We'll get into the environmental fight that hit the industry harder than anything before it. We'll talk about what got lost culturally when the lumberjack stopped being a common American job. And we'll end with the handful of people still out there today, doing it the old way. Here's the twist most people get wrong. The villain of this story isn't who you'd expect. By 1850, lumber had become the largest industry in the United States, full stop. As the frontier pushed west, the industry followed it, first through the dense pine forests of the Midwest, then out to the towering old-growth stands of the Pacific Northwest. This was the era of the timber baron, men like Frederick Weyerhaeuser, who built sprawling logging empires and in doing so, entire company towns around them. These weren't just job sites, they were self-contained worlds, with company stores, company housing, and company rules, built wherever the timber was thickest. Logs were moved the only way they could be at the time, floated down rivers in massive spring drives, or later hauled out on dedicated logging railroads once the easy river access ran out. The numbers tell the story better than any anecdote could. American mills produced roughly 5 billion board feet of lumber in 1850, and by 1900, that number had exploded to around 35 billion. That's not incremental growth. That's an industry completely remaking itself in 50 years. And as the Great Lakes forests were stripped bare by the early 1900s, the entire center of gravity of the industry shifted again, out toward the Pacific coast, chasing the last of the old growth. Logging camps sprang up across the country, lumberjacks became folk heroes, and cutting down trees was, quite literally, one of the most common jobs a working man in America could have. But the same relentless push for efficiency that built this empire would eventually be the thing that started shrinking it. The first real crack in the old system came in the 1950s, when the chainsaw went from a rare, clunky novelty to a standard tool on the job site. Almost overnight, a single logger with a chainsaw could do the work that used to take a full crew with two-man crosscut saws. Output per worker roughly doubled. Case studies from logging communities in this era showed just how fast the shift happened. Within a single decade, hand tools that had barely changed in a century were essentially retired from professional use. On the surface, that sounds like a win. Faster work, less physical strain. But look closer and the real story emerges. The same volume of timber could now be harvested by a fraction of the previous workforce. The chainsaw wasn't just a tool upgrade. It was the first machine that quietly started making loggers unnecessary, one crew at a time. And that was just the beginning. From the 1960s through the 1990s, an entirely new category of machine moved into the woods. Skidders came first, dragging felled logs out faster than any team of men or horses ever could. Then, by the late 1970s, feller forwarders and similar harvesting rigs arrived, able to grip, cut, and stack a tree in seconds, with a single operator sitting in a climate-controlled cab instead of a crew standing on the ground. Each machine that arrived didn't just speed up the work, it replaced an entire role that used to belong to a person. By the 2000s, mechanized harvesting handled up to 95% of the cutting on some company timberlands. Today, the numbers make the shift impossible to ignore. Roughly 30,900 logging equipment operators work in the U.S., compared to just 5,600 fallers. the people who still cut trees down by hand. Government labor projections show equipment operator roles holding relatively steady in the years ahead, while hand-falling positions are expected to keep declining. The job hadn't disappeared. It had changed shape entirely, moving from an axe and a chainsaw to a joystick. But mechanization alone doesn't explain everything. Something else hit this industry hard, and it had nothing to do with machines. In 1990, the northern spotted owl was listed under the Endangered Species Act. A year later, a federal court order effectively halted logging across vast stretches of old-growth forest in the Pacific Northwest. By 1994, the Northwest Forest Plan formalized sweeping new restrictions, and federal timber harvest in the region collapsed by roughly 80%. In Oregon, some estimates put the drop above 90%. Here's where the story gets genuinely contested. One well-known study found that logging employment had already fallen about 90% between 1947 and 1964, driven almost entirely by mechanization, decades before the owl was ever listed, suggesting the industry's workforce was already a shadow of its former size by the time the owl controversy even began. But newer, peer-reviewed research pushes back on that framing, arguing the owl's listing still caused a real and measurable employment hit on top of the mechanization losses, hitting timber-dependent communities that had already absorbed decades of job losses. So which was it? The machines or the owl? Honestly, both, just at different times. And it depends which decade you're looking at. First, the chainsaw thinned the crews, then the machines took over almost entirely. Then the law slammed the door on what was left of the old-growth harvest. Somewhere in the middle of all this, America lost something less measurable than a job number. Paul Bunyan started as genuine oral folklore, swapped between real working loggers in camps as far back as the 1890s, before an advertising campaign turned him into a national icon in 1916, complete with the giant blue ox sidekick most people picture today. Here's the strange part. By 1958, Disney had already released a short film imagining Paul Bunyan losing a contest to a machine. Popular culture was grappling with the lumberjack's obsolescence before it had even fully happened, turning a real working-class trade into a nostalgic myth, right as that trade was becoming rare. The lumberjack became one of the most recognizable archetypes in American identity, at almost the exact moment the real version of that job was quietly vanishing. So, where does that leave things today? According to federal labor data, only about 5,600 fallers remain in the entire country. And that number is projected to keep shrinking faster than nearly any other logging role. These are the loggers still working steep, rugged terrain that machines simply can't reach yet, where the ground is too unstable or the slope too extreme for a harvester to operate safely, leaving hand felling as the only practical option. It's also, by the government's own data, one of the more hazardous jobs left in America, which helps explain why fewer people are choosing to enter it as older fallers retire. This isn't a guess or an estimate pulled from a news story. It's an official government labor projection, and it lands with real weight. Hand felling, once the most common job in America, is now one of the rarest. So what actually happened to the most American job there is? It wasn't one villain. It was two waves of machines in one major regulatory shift, decades apart, each hitting an industry already shrinking. And somewhere in that timeline, the lumberjack became one of America's defining symbols right as the real job behind it was disappearing. Today, the people keeping that image alive number only in the thousands. So here's a question worth sitting with. If the lumberjack disappears completely, does the myth disappear with it, or does it get stronger?